Hi, welcome to Focus Talk. Today we're going to interview China analyst Mr. Gordon Chang to talk about recent reports about Chinese Communist Party's infiltration of American elite circles. Mr. Gordon Chang joins us remotely on Skype. Hi, Gordon. Great to see you.
Oh, hi. Thank you so much.
Hi. Thank you for coming to our show. Lately, there's so many reports about Chinese Communist Party's infiltration of the U.S. society. I don't even know where to start. But this particular incident about Congressman Eric Swalwell is very alarming. So let's start there. I'm sure a lot of media have already interviewed you about this incident. So recent reports have shown that Congressman Eric Swalwell had ties with a CCP spy named Fang Fang back in 2014 and earlier. He was warned by the FBI in 2015 before he cut ties with her. Eric Swalwell is on the House Intelligence Committee and has access to this country's top secrets. What does this whole thing tell us?
Well, first of all, it tells us how extensive China's Ministry of State Security has penetrated the American political system. First of all, yes, sitting on the House Intel Committee is important to Beijing, but that's not the first time that China contacted him. They contacted him for the first time when he was on the city council of Dublin City, California. And that means that Beijing is trying to groom American politicians all over the country at very low levels, hoping that they will rise in influence, which is, of course, what Swalwell did. He got a seat in Congress, and then he got a seat on the House Intel Committee. So this is, for China, was a great bonanza. I don't know if they got anything from him, but it shows you the persistence of their efforts. We know that there are hundreds, probably thousands of Ministry of State Security agents in the United States, but we also know that there are hundreds of thousands of collectors of intelligence for China. And that's because China has this 1,000 grain of sand approach where they interview returning business people, tourists, students, to get information which they then collate with artificial intelligence and big data. So we know that China has thoroughly penetrated the United States and has many, many collectors of information and intelligence.
So this is shocking. That means that this is not an isolated incident, and it shows that CCP does take years to try to cultivate this kind of relationship, and they send thousands of spies into America, right?
Right. Well, Fang Fang, for instance, she not only was bundling cash for Swalwell's campaign, she also was able to place an intern in Swalwell's office. So God knows what happened there. And the other thing, according to the Axios reporting, Christine Fang, had sexual relations with two Midwestern mayors. Now, Swalwell has yet to deny or confirm the allegations that she had sex with him. And so, therefore, there's a lot more there that we need to find out, because obviously that could lead to China having information about Swalwell that they could continue to use, even though Fang Fang returned to China in 2015.
Now, should the FBI do more in terms of alarm these politicians? Why are American... Go ahead.
Yes, of course, the FBI should, but the FBI is overwhelmed. FBI Director Christopher Wray this year said that almost half of the Bureau's counterintelligence cases are China-related. And he said that the Bureau opens up a China-related case every 10 hours. And when you look at the other cases, that other countries are running, China probably benefits from information that Russia or Iran, for instance, collects. So law enforcement in the U.S. is just completely overwhelmed. And that really means that we are at a critical point, because this is an espionage emergency.
So why are American politicians fall for the CCP honey trap so easily? You just mentioned that Fang Fang had sexual relationship with at least two local politicians. Is that because the lack of awareness?
That's a great question, and it's a question I really don't have an answer to, because you think that they would be smarter, but obviously they are not. At this point, we've had a lot of people in the political class talk about Russia, including Swalwell, for instance, when they should have been saying China, China, China. And that's a real indication that there is a failure of perception here. It's not a sin to be targeted by China's Ministry of State Security, because that's true, I'm sure, of all 435 members of the House of Representatives and the 100 senators. But what's the problem here is that Swalwell has not been forthcoming. And indeed, sitting on the House Intel Committee, he should realize the danger that China poses, but he doesn't talk about that in public. He only talks about Russia, which is a real indication that he's propagating a Chinese narrative. And that's an indication that Christine Fang, although she's no longer here, is exercising some sort of influence over Representative Swalwell.
Wow. Some people said that they even have a recent connection on Facebook as recent as like December or October.
That's right.
Go ahead.
Swalwell's father and I think brother or something still are in contact with her on social media.
Yeah. Even the director of national intelligence said that the CCP is the biggest threat to the country. But we don't hear much about it. We always hear Russia, Russia, Russia. But lately, there are like tons of reports and evidences and incidents coming up showing that CCP's threat to this country is growing. So this spy incident is a vivid example showing how CCP has been cultivating its friends in America's core inner circle of power and influence. Now, this is the exact words from that explosive Di Dongsheng video. Di Dongsheng is a professor in China's Renmin University in Beijing. And in that same video, Di Dongsheng also told a story about how a DC bookstore owner was coerced into agreeing to publish the Xi Jinping book after initially refusing to do it. That was shocking. So is this one of the common tactics the CCP is using to manipulate their so-called friends in America to achieve what they want?
Yeah, China does that. And it shows you the thoroughness of their penetration. Because, we're talking about a presentation by an author at Politics and Prose, the famous Washington bookstore. I mean, they've actually got down to that level where they try to exercise influence. But of course, Politics and Prose is one thing. The White House is another. And Di Dongsheng, when he was talking about this on that November 28th audience event, which was broadcast around China, he was just chortling about how China was looking forward to the return of the elites to the American political system, to the center of the political system, because he was saying that in administrations prior to that of President Trump, that China could do what it wanted to, could talk to the White House, could get outcomes that it wanted. But it couldn't do that during the Trump administration. But they were looking forward to being able to do that with a Biden presidency. And that's a real warning that China is going to have that influence to be able to make those, to be able to determine those outcomes at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue.
So to what extent do you think the CCP has infiltrated American elite circles, not only political, but Wall Street, business, all these big corporations?
Yes, and it's educational institutions, and it's not just colleges and universities. It's also prep schools. You have the Confucius classrooms in secondary schools, the foundations, NGOs. If there's an institution in the U.S., China is targeting it. So China's influence here is vast, which means that we've got a lot of work to do to remove the Chinese Communist Party from our society, because they are certainly up to no good.
How did they do it? How come they're so successful in terms of infiltrating American elite circles?
That's a really critical question. And there are a couple of reasons. First of all, they just bought influence. And we can see this in the sordid tale involving Hunter Biden. President-elect Biden's son. So there's just out-and-out money. They hold out business opportunities, which is something that Republicans are complaining about with Brian Kemp, the Republican governor of Georgia. But also, there's a more fundamental issue here, and that is, we Americans at the end of the Cold War thought that history had ended, to borrow that phrase from Francis Fukuyama. And they thought, things didn't matter anymore. And people believed that if we integrated China into the international system, if we worked with China, if we showed it goodwill, if we helped China strengthen itself, that they would reciprocate. But China didn't become benign, as the proponents of engagements told us. It's become more aggressive, more belligerent, more hostile, more dangerous. So we've got to ditch a half century of thinking about China. And that, of course, takes time. But, it seems to me that the danger is clear and present, and we have got to act immediately because we don't have much time to lose. Xi Jinping, the Chinese ruler, he doesn't talk about competing with us in the international system. He is floating these ideas that China has the mandate of heaven over Tianxia, or all under heaven. And China actually acts like emperors of old who believed that they were the only sovereigns in the world, which means essentially that, Americans are just subservient. We don't have a country. We don't have sovereignty. Now, I know that sounds ludicrous, but we've got to listen to what Chinese leaders are actually saying. And they are dropping hints that they should be considered the world's only sovereigns. So they've made it very clear, and we just have not been listening.
Well, in other words, we were caught off guard, right? But I think part of the responsibility lies with the media or with the globalists who often promote this kind of narrative. I don't know if they truly believe it or if they promote a narrative for some own purpose, but people were told, let's have this engagement policy with China, and they will eventually become a fair player. Isn't that what we were told in all last 40 years?
Yes, we've been told that. This goes back to Richard Nixon's famous article in Foreign Affairs, where he says that we can't leave the Chinese outside of the international system there to nurture their hates and fantasies. But Nixon later understood that, as he said to Kissinger, that we may have created a Frankenstein. And indeed, that's exactly what happened. So, you talk about why Americans feel this way. Mm-hmm. Well, I think some Americans are just generally naive. And I think other Americans know what's going on, but they propose these multilateral notions of the way the world should be for commercial purposes, to enrich themselves. But whatever the motivations are, that's wrong, and we've got to change course. And if we don't change course, we're going to lose our country, because China poses an existential risk to us. And if we don't understand the fundamental nature of the challenge, we're going to lose, and we're going to lose our country.
Yeah, and I think recently with the Trump administration, I think it's very important that they start to differentiate between the Chinese Communist Party and the Chinese people. And the Chinese Communist Party doesn't represent the Chinese people, nor do they represent China. I think that's a key differentiation that probably will allow many people to realize that the threat of the CCP. And on the other hand, I want to ask you something. Just yesterday, the director of National Intelligence Office, they said that they have to postpone their report about foreign interference of this election. A lot of people were expecting it to come out this Friday, but they said they have to postpone it. And word has it that because there are different opinions inside the intelligence agency, some people feel strongly that China interfered with this election. Some don't think so. So what's your take on this situation?
I think China clearly interfered. I mean, the trend of Chinese propaganda, for instance, was that Biden should get the Democratic Party nomination over Bernie Sanders. And then during the general election, they favored Biden over President Trump. But we also know that China tried to cause chaos. The New York Times reported that in the middle of March, Beijing, through text messages and social media feeds, propagated a rumor that it had to know was false. And that rumor that President Trump was going to invoke the Stafford Act and lock down the entire country. That certainly didn't help President Trump at all. And we know that these large Chinese networks like Spamiflage Dragon, which relentlessly attack the president on YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter. We know that the social media platforms have taken down a massive number of fake Chinese accounts. Twitter in June alone took down 174,000 fake accounts. So we know that they were actively involved. And we have a number of indications that it was not to help the president.
Yeah, but then where does this obstacle come from? Why can't this report be published on time?
For the reason you said, there is disagreement in the intel community about the effect, about the extensive nature of China's involvement. So I think that essentially, there might be some honest disagreements, but the overall trend is that China was substantially involved in our elections. They did this with this malicious disinformation campaigns on the surface. They did it with their troll and bot farm operations below the surface, but they were involved, and they've been involved for a very long time. So I don't understand why people are disagreeing over the fundamental question, did China intervene? Yes, it did. We can argue about to what extent it intervened, but not the fact that they did, because they certainly were caught doing this.
Well, lastly, I want to talk about the leak of a list of 2 million CCP members. Now, these CCP members, they're embedded in governments and big corporations around the world. People say that it shows CCP's global infiltration efforts. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, there are two aspects of infiltration. People focused on Communist Party members in multinationals, such as Boeing and Pfizer. I mean, that shouldn't be a surprise because the Communist Party has demanded that big companies host Communist Party cells. I mean, we'd be surprised if there weren't Communist Party members in these big companies. What took me a little bit by surprise was that the revelation that there were 10 consulates in Shanghai with Communist Party members. And it's not only the United States, not only Britain, not only Australia, but also New Zealand. That's 4 of the Five Eyes partners. Right. Five Eyes is the intelligence sharing consortium. So, we give them our best stuff. They give us their best stuff. And they've got Communist Party members in the Shanghai consulate. So this to me is I've never understood why the United States employs Chinese nationals in the consulate, in the consulates in China. And I know China demands it, but my view would be if you demand it, you're just not going to have a consulate. We're not going to have a consulate in Shanghai, and you're not going to have one in San Francisco. The possibility of catastrophic breaches of security are there when you have Chinese nationals working in your diplomatic compounds. So to me, this is a story about China's effective penetration of the U.S. and other governments. It's really a story of the failure of our governments to comprehend the Chinese spying challenge to us. There's espionage there. It's an emergency, as I said. We should know about it. And the fact that we allow these Chinese nationals and Communist Party members in our consulates, to me, is an outrage.
Yeah, I think we are too slow. Now, why do you think the CCP keeps such a list? Are they asking these 2 million CCP members to report periodically, like one report per week or something?
Well, yeah, Communist Party actively has meetings all the time, has their members report. When you run an organization of 92 million, you got to know who your members are. And this is a stunning breach. One of the other stories here is that the Communist Party is leaky itself.
That's true.
That there are people who risk their lives to get this information to us. And this is a story of brave Chinese men and women. But the reason why they had that list in the first place was, they needed to know who their members were.
And they probably need to know who are the members in these big corporations in the Five Eyes countries. But not only in corporations, some of these CCP members are in U.S. universities as well. Now, earlier this month, Secretary Pompeo gave a speech at Georgia Institute of Technology, and he said, quote, "The Chinese Communist Party is poisoning the well of our higher education institutions for its own ends," end quote. We know some academians are already compromised by the CCP, like the chemistry professor, right, from Harvard. And there may be many Chinese students who are spying for CCP and stealing technologies on campus. What do we do about this situation in the education field?
This is a really tough issue. I think it's one of the toughest issues that the U.S. has with China. And, my dad was a student from China. So to me, this is a real issue.
Yeah. And how do we differentiate between good and bad students?
Well, there are a couple of things. First of all, we know that every Chinese national in the U.S. is under a potential legal compulsion to spy, because China's 2017 National Intelligence Law, Articles 7 and 14, require Chinese nationals to spy for Beijing if demanded. Also, in the Communist Party's top-down system, no individual can resist a demand from the party. So we know that we've got 370,000 potential spies on American colleges' campuses. The estimate is about 13% of them engage in espionage activities or inappropriate activities. And I think that one way we deal with this is we get all the Ministry of State Security agents off our soil. We know who a number of them are. I think we should just get them out of our country, expel them. But also I think that we need to close all 4 remaining Chinese consulates, and we need to cut back the Chinese embassy staff to just the ambassador and a driver and a secretary and immediate family. We should also be thinking about closing the Chinese state banks and the Chinese state enterprises in our country. And another thing, we know that the ambassador, Choi Ten-kai, he was involved in an attempt to recruit a scientist in Connecticut as a spy. And he did that with somebody from the New York consulate. So I think, this was a couple of years ago. We've known about this for a long time. We've allowed the ambassador to stay in our country. I think that's outrageous. He should have been expelled. And we should be expelling every Chinese official we can find. And the reason is, right now we've got an emergency. Our law enforcement, FBI, CIA, they're completely overwhelmed. And so we can't deal with this without a drastic measure. So although people may say it's going too far, the problem is we've got a national emergency and we've got to deal with it effectively. And I don't think that the traditional methods of dealing with China's espionage are working. So we got to try something else. We got to try something that will work, and that's expelling the Chinese.
So you're saying that you think these Chinese consulates, they play a key role in terms of coordinating and facilitating the espionage activities in U.S.?
Yes, we know that. So, for instance, in June, a researcher who was accused of hiding her links to the People's Liberation Army, she's at the University of California, Davis, and she was questioned by the FBI. As soon as she was questioned, she ran to the Chinese consulate in San Francisco, where she camped out for almost a month. It was only in July that the consulate surrendered her to U.S. authorities. That was inappropriate to me, of harboring a fugitive from the U.S. I think we should have closed the consulate and expelled everybody except for that researcher who we probably should hold in detention pending trial. So to me, we've been far too tolerant of Chinese espionage activities on our soil. So this is not just a question of Chinese consulate members and Ministry of State Security people committing crimes against the U.S. This is a question of U.S. tolerance, and we shouldn't be tolerant. So this is our fault as well.
Now, in addition to what you just said, what else do you think we can do as a nation to defend and defeat the CCP infiltration? What about in terms of raising public awareness? Could we do something there?
We can certainly raise public awareness, but I think that we need to do some other drastic things as well. And that is that there are a lot of people in our country who have an interest in trade with China. And therefore, they carry the narratives of Beijing. I believe that we should be cutting all trade, all investment, all technology sharing agreements with China, because China is using the proceeds of these commercial links to build up its military, which is configured to kill Americans. And, you know, every so often, too frequently, you have Chinese flag officers in public talking with glee about killing Americans in large numbers. So we shouldn't be enabling China to kill Americans. That to me seems like common sense, but apparently it is not accepted in this country. But I think we absolutely have to cut those links. And that will mean that Americans will no longer have an interest in supporting the Communist Party. This is just economics 101. You break the commercial links, Americans are not going to be holding China's water, carrying China's water.
Now, one last thing. A lot of our audience are freedom-loving Chinese people around the world. And a lot of American Chinese Americans, they fled communist China to this country. And they love and they will do whatever they can to protect the freedom of this country. So can you say some words to these Chinese people, to our Chinese audience?
We in the world, whether you're Americans or British or French or wherever you are, the Communist Party of China is coming for you. This is an existential struggle. They want to end our freedom and our liberty. They want to take down our sovereignty. So we have no choice but to defend ourselves. And the time is now, because Beijing is pressing everybody hard. So now is the time to fight. We have to fight, or we're going to lose what we have.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Gordon, for coming to our show and share these important insights with us, with our viewers. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for this opportunity, because this is a critical time.
Yeah, I fully agree with you. Thank you, Gordon Chang, author of The Coming Collapse of China and the China Analyst. Thank you, Gordon. See you next time.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you for watching Focus Talk. That was our interview with China analyst, Mr. Gordon Chang. We'll see you next time.